Have you ever sat and stared up at the stars and wondered, where did we come from? Let's take a journey like no other, not to a place, but to a time. Join us as we delve deep into the human past and explore our shared human origins. Welcome to the world of paleoanthropology.
Hey everyone, it's Seth from World of Paleoanthropology. I'm very excited today to be recording another episode of The Story of Us. Today we are joined by a special guest. I know I say that about all of our guests because they are truly so special, because without them, our field would not be where it is. And, I try to pick people who are really inspiring and do things that not only drive the field forward, but prepare the next generation. So today I want to introduce our next guest, and I will hand it over to her to introduce herself.
Oh, well, thank you so much. My name is Jill Pruetz. I am an anthropologist and also a primatologist. I'm a biological anthropologist, and my focus is on West African chimpanzees. I work at Texas State University, where I also went to school as an undergrad. And my main study site is in Senegal, West Africa.
Wonderful. And you do regular field work, correct?
I do. I try to be in the field as much as I can. The past few years, I haven't been in the field as much. So I've been running the project for over 20 years now, 22 years. I used to spend almost like half the time out there, half of the year out there, but lately it's been, just a few months per year. But I've got a Senegalese crew, and for example, during COVID, they didn't really need me. They kept things going. So yeah, I mean, I love being out there. It's my favorite thing to do, but I fortunately have a really good crew that I've worked with for many years. And so even when I'm not there, they're collecting data, all the time. Yep.
That's great. And, what work are you actually doing? There's so many things you can do when you're studying animals. So are you studying everything that chimps do, or are you focused on one particular aspect of their behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things I really like about these chimps is that they guide my study. So I went out, of course, with certain questions. I'm interested in behavioral ecology and specifically diet. That was what I studied when I was in grad school. But the chimps here live in the Savannah ecosystem, Savannah biome, and they hadn't been habituated to observer presence before I started this project. And so following them from dawn to dusk, right? So I went out with these questions about diet and things, and I still am interested in that. But basically what we've found over the years is these chimps are doing some really rare behaviors compared to chimps elsewhere, and in some cases unique behaviors. And so that's really guided what I study. And we always have, specific topics that we focus on at the moment. So right now I have a couple of Ph.D. students there working on microbiomes. And I had done a preliminary study a couple of years ago, right during COVID is when we got the funding, of course. And so that's been a focus the past couple of years. My assistant director, who is Dr. Landing Baji, he's a Senegalese primatologist. He's studying hormones and also medicinal plant use. And so that's our kind of narrow focus right now, but we've been collecting data since 2005 on the chimps' basic behavior, ranging behavior, diet, social behavior. And so I am consistent with that type of data collection. So then we can compare data over the long term and look at specific individuals and how their behavior may change as they age, and look at a number of factors that influence their behavior. So it's kind of a mix. We always have the basic data collection going, and in demographic data, health data, things like that. But then I have specific projects that we focus on that are more short term in nature.
Now, That sounds fascinating. And I know there's so many people who watch this show who, are fans of Jane Goodall and, I love the thought of going on adventures in Africa with chimpanzees. And, I've had Dr. Craig Sanford on before. So we've talked a bit about chimps and what they do, but why are you studying what you're studying? What brought you to wanting to go to Senegal, and what was the path that led you there?
Well, there's a couple. I had an odd path. It was not straight at all, I have to say. So if anybody ever feels like they're, not on this kind of trajectory that they feel like they should be on, I wouldn't worry about it at all, because, it's worked out okay for me, I have to say. But one of the first things that happened to me was that I volunteered and I worked with captive chimpanzees, and that ruined me for every other species. So once I worked with chimpanzees, I'm like, I have to work with chimps. I mean, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. And in fact, when I started out, I didn't want to study chimps because everybody wanted to kind of, that was what it seemed like. And primatology is like, chimps were, you wanted to go out and basically, do what Jane Goodall did. And I didn't. I actually focused on other primate species in theory, what I wanted to ask. But I found a research facility that was close to where I grew up, and I volunteered there, and I ended up working there for a year. And it really did open my eyes to how similar chimps are to humans, but how different they are too. So it was just so intriguing. I never looked back. And then the Savannah aspect of it. So for my dissertation work, I studied monkeys in Kenya. I didn't study chimps when I was a grad student. And I love the Savannah environment. I grew up in South Texas. I don't know if that's part of it. I'm used to the heat. But I loved that Savannah environment. And so one of the few places where chimps had been studied in the Savannah was Senegal. And so I approached Bill McGrew, who had a position in the States at that time, and asked him if he needed a postdoc, and he somehow finagled one for me. And that's what kicked off my studies in Senegal. So you have chimpanzees there, and they live in the savanna biome. And there are other places where now they've been habituated, like in Tanzania and in Uganda. They're also studied in a savanna area. It's not quite as hot and dry in those areas in East Africa as it is in Senegal, but that's what led me there. And then as an anthropologist too, I was really interested in chimps for what they might tell us about hominin evolution, and specifically the earliest hominin. So, predating even bipedal hominins, I guess, right at the, kind of the juncture of the last common ancestor, the late Miocene, that time period. To me, that's intriguing. And so that's, one of my reasons as well. I find them fascinating, but I have to say that I do love chimps for their own sake. And so that's probably the number one reason that led me to study chimpanzees here.
Absolutely. Now, one question that I have is how what is the importance in understanding the difference of chimps living in what we would call a stereotypical environment for them, or living on a savanna biome as you study? What implications does this have on our understanding of their behavior?
Sure. Well, I always make what we call the argument from homology as well as from analogy. And so they are one of our closest living relatives, but they also live in this environment that we think that some of the earliest hominins lived in as well. It's savanna. It's really a savanna woodland. It's technically a savanna. Grass understory is the most prominent type of vegetation. So you do have tiny patches of forest, but at Fongoli, for example, it makes up only about 3% of their home range. And what you see here is that these great apes are subjected to different types of stresses compared to what we've seen in apes studied, including gorillas and orangutans and even gibbons. And the stresses that you see in this type of environment include heat stress and that exacerbates water scarcity. So water stress is a huge problem for them. You know, in theory, they do okay, but you know, that to me is one of the most interesting reasons to look at these apes, to see how they deal with these different types of stresses, because we do think that the earliest hominins also had to deal with similar types of challenges, right? And then the habitat itself is a woodland. It's, again, the canopy is not connected. They travel on the ground. They do most of their movement on the ground. And so they have different challenges in this type of environment that we just didn't really know about until we were able to habituate them and observe their behavior. And that to me is really fascinating. So it lets us I would say it informs our hypotheses about early hominins. So you do have to be careful when you make analogies, but at least it gives us some insight into our closest living relative and how they deal with this particular stressor.
Right, right. What has been the most surprising thing you've learned about the difference between savanna chimps and more jungle environment chimps?
Sure. I mean, for me, I actually think that the way they use water is the most surprising. I think in general, people might say it's the way they hunt with tools, which, we've had hundreds and hundreds, probably over 600 cases recorded now since we started studying them a long time ago. And that's only been observed literally less than 5 times ever at any other chimpanzee study site. But to me, it's the way that they actually will compete over access to water. And we know that sanctuary chimpanzees and bonobos will definitely use water when it's hot, and other chimps will move through water to get access to a food resource. But at Fongoli, they really use it to thermoregulate, and they will compete over access to these pools of water. And so for somebody that studies chimps, that was really surprising, because for years we characterized chimps based on the Gombe chimps, because Jane Goodall started that project. This, it was its oldest ongoing project, and Gombe chimps, or she even described them as hydrophobic, right? And so to see these chimps compete over access to these pools of water, and they just chill out and soak, and even at night they'll come down and soak and get back up in the night nest and do this, multiple times a night. That to me, as a primatologist and somebody that studies chimps, was the most surprising thing, I think.
And that is very surprising and interesting to hear how different they use water, to hear that chimps at Gombe were afraid and not liking water to animals that are literally playing in it, I assume, and just sitting in it. And that's remarkable. So as we said, there's probably a lot of people watching this who are very interested and want to follow a similar path as yourself, where they work with chimps or they study primates of any kind, really. How would you suggest, and I know you said you had a windy path, so keeping that in mind and everything, how would you suggest someone does what you do? How can someone contribute to what's already going on?
Oh my gosh, there's so much to be done, really. And I guess what I always recommend is that if you can, if at all possible, I stress doing some sort of internship, some sort of experience. And so that really snowballs. Like I said, I started out working with captive chimpanzees, and I had done a field school. I started out interested in archaeology, actually. And so I did a field work in Belize. I loved it. I love being in the field, but I decided I wanted to switch gears a little and do primatology. But that, just being in the field, gave me experience. So then, basically employer or advisor knows that you can hack it. Our field school was 6 weeks. Most of them nowadays are 4 weeks. And way back then, there were no primate field schools. And these days you have that option. It is expensive. I teach a field school myself, and it's something that I feel like everyone tries to work on, is to make it affordable for students. But it can be prohibitive. If at all possible, I suggest students do that. And if not, just some sort of experience. The thing about zoos and other facilities, sanctuaries, is they can give you experience that is incredibly valuable. So I started out studying chimps in captivity. It gave me access to chimps so that I could see all this complex communication that chimps have. And so it really kind of gave me a step up to studying wild chimpanzees, because I had, watched all this really complex social behavior up close. So there are a lot of different ways you could start out. These days I think it's getting a little better, but it's hard to find paid positions. And that's something I feel like people are working on, to try to make internships that are paid, some sort of paid position, but it is difficult. You really need to get your foot in the door. And then, like I said, once that happens, it really snowballs. That's what happened for me. And so I started out volunteering, and then I got a job with these chimps, and then I got a job managing someone's project in Kenya, and it just kind of took off from there. And even if you take a field school and you decide you don't like it, that to me is worth it. So I did the archaeological field school, loved it, but decided to switch gears. So
Right.
it's one of the best things that I did. So I always recommend that. And then one thing I always say is to reach out. And I think that people are a lot better at networking these days, and there's easier ways of networking, or at least, in virtual networking that wasn't available when I was in school. But that sort of thing is just to be persistent and don't take it personally. I'm not great about getting back to emails, but you can imagine everyone has a million emails. And if you catch me at the right time, then I'm like, I'll whip off a quick email. And sometimes I just may say that, I got this, I'm not ignoring you. Other times it gets buried, in my inbox. But, I even tell my students, just don't email me again. Don't feel bad about emailing me. It's not personal. It's just, you need to get it. You need to be persistent. And I feel like I was really good at being persistent. Even though I consider myself an extreme introvert, I was good about being persistent. So that's another bit of advice I'd give.
Absolutely. I think being persistent is one of the key factors of success in any field. So absolute great piece of advice. What do you think? You said that there was a lot of work to be done in the field concerning chimps. Shifting gears a little bit, what can you tell us about Fongoli and the work that's being done specifically there to preserve and continue what's going on?
So one of the things that we're doing at Fongoli is focusing again kind of on what people might call biological aspects of their behavior, but you still the microbiome, but it's all part of their behavioral ecology. So we're kind of bringing that in, and we want to make a long-term database on aspects of that type of chimpanzee research that we haven't focused on as much at Fongoli. But there are a number of different aspects of behavior that we're still exploring. And so there's a team there right now, and they're looking at locomotion. There's another team, and these are from other universities, that is looking at gestural communication. And so I've had various students over the years look at these topics, and I'm always open to people, coming out and exploring with me, what they might do at the site. But I also have a huge database that can be mined, I have to say. One of the reasons that we're also focusing on things like the microbiome and the health of the chimpanzees is that we are worried about their conservation in the long term. And so over the past decade, especially, there's been a real gold rush in Senegal, literally. And so it's brought with it an influx of people. And at Fongoli, the chimps live outside of national park areas. In fact, in Senegal, most of the chimps are outside of national parks. And they've lived alongside humans, I say, for millennia. And the people in Senegal have taboos against eating chimps, against harming chimps for the most part, unless there's some, severe conflict. But that could break down easily because of the influx of people from other areas that don't have this taboos. And just the number of people coming in has greatly disturbed the environment. The thing about chimps in this type of environment, they're used to open spaces. So they can deal with open spaces, they can deal with humans, but they've been dealing with, these small patches of, not small, but, relatively small patches of grassland. It's not like the Serengeti or anything, but it's woodland, grassland. And then people are horticulturalists there. They farm during the rainy season. The chimps are used to that, and they adjust to humans being in their environment. But when you have so many people coming in and the urban population at a nearby town is also booming, then you do have different problems. And one of those has to do with health. And I have a doctoral student that's studying, for example, mercury and the use of mercury to process gold in the area, and how that may affect food sources, water sources, the chimps themselves. And there's been other people that have done similar work. So we're looking at conservation related questions. And I happen to be in a department that has an applied Ph.D. program. And so conservation studies fits perfectly into this applied anthropology program. So that's really where we're going these days is we're still collecting data on behavioral ecology, what I've been doing for decades, but pointedly looking at aspects of the chimps' behavior and ecology that ties into their conservation in this area.
Right. Now, you say that the structural base of the relationship between the humans and the chimps could break down very quickly. Does that mean it has not yet, and that we're still seeing an okay level of the population, or is it starting to break down already?
Yeah, and I guess maybe I shouldn't have said break down. It's so the people living in the area, I don't see that taboo like breaking down, but it's also the people coming in from other areas that don't have the same taboo. So that, complicates things. But I have to say we're at so the Fongoli chimps are a small community of chimps, and on average we usually have about 32 individuals in the community. Right now we have 34. There were 3 babies born last year, so we're kind of at one of the high points. They seem to be doing okay. We're out there with them. So when there are conflicts, actually, they have the advantage of us being there. So I was there in March. Okay. The day after I left, one of the adult males was attacked by hunting dogs. And if researchers hadn't been there, he would have not survived. I can't even imagine it, but my head researcher, Michelle Sajaho, told me there were something like 50 dogs, and I just can't even imagine that. But they were able to, free him from those dogs. And, something like that helps our community of chimps, but then the neighboring community of chimps that actually has a bigger gold mine near its range and is unhabituated, doesn't have the same type of protection, even though you still have the Senegalese people with these taboos about not harming chimps and not hurting chimps. So yeah, it's just, there's a lot of things happening there. It's a very complex type of situation, but I mean, it's hard sometimes, but to try to take a positive look at it is the fact that these chimps are there because of the people in Senegal. And that is something that maybe doesn't always come to mind when you think about conservation, because, humans, we can mess things up. But
to say it lightly.
Right. Yeah. Try to be nice about it. But, that's the reason that those chimps are there, that I'm able to study them, is that people in Senegal have had these cultural taboos. And it's really interesting. I've had students do, one did a master's thesis on what she called folklore and creation narratives that brought in primates, specifically chimps. So it's really fascinating. But that's the reason that you have chimps here. And there are a number of other animals that have not survived in this area. They've been exterminated, or just because of land exploitation or what have you, land use, that they haven't survived in this area. But chimps are still around, and that's pretty amazing, I think.
And are there any other large primates in the area that they compete with dietarily or anything?
Yeah, so at Fongoli, you have the Guinea baboons, are probably the largest primate. And then you have paddis monkeys, the green monkeys, which are like vervet. And the only other non-human primate is Galago, the Galago senegalensis, the little bush baby that the chimps eat. There, once upon a time, there were pottos in this region as well. And my very first research assistant, who has since passed, he remembered when there were pottos in the area. He also remembered when there were wild dogs. And he said it wasn't that many years ago, but I'm not exactly sure what that means, because we have different versions of time. But it was always fascinating to hear him talk about. We still have leopards at Fongoli, but he said he could walk from Fongoli to Petit Dubaji, is another little village. It's like 3 kilometers away, and he said you'd hear the leopards as you walk there, every night. And he grew up out there. He was amazing. But yeah, so right now you have baboons are the biggest primate, and chimps do hunt all these primates. In fact, it's rare that they capture paddis monkeys. Yeah, but they have captured paddis monkeys. I think 4 or 5 times, I want to say now, but it's difficult to capture, the fastest primate. But they can do it sometimes. But we don't, because of the nature of the habitat, there are no colobus monkeys here, for example. Right. So what you see as the main prey species for chimps in most forested areas, yeah, you don't have it Fongoli. Instead, you have paddis, savanna dwelling primates.
So they still have a pattern of meat eating, even though their main, what a regular chimp's main resource would be, is different.
I feel like, like most chimps, they are definitely interested in hunting and eating meat. The most common prey item for them is the bush baby. And so that's why we see so many cases of tool assisted or spear hunting, is that's what they go after most often. We have a really high density of bush babies at the site. I've had a couple of graduate students from other universities come and do dissertation and thesis work there, and so it's a healthy population. I have a lot of guilt about the bush babies, but that is what they hunt most frequently. I have to say that we do feel like there's been a decline, for example, in baboons since the gold rush, and I don't know if that's just baboons keeping quiet. And they are afraid of humans in the area, because baboons, paddis monkeys, and the green monkeys crop raid. And so they're in conflict with humans. And I have to say, knock on wood, that the chimps at my site don't crop raid. But we haven't seen as many baboons, and our surveys are pretty opportunistic of these other primates, because they are afraid of humans, a lot more afraid than the chimps were when we started. And the chimps, I have to say, are not habituated to humans in general, just my team of researchers.
Okay. Where do you see Fongoli in 10 years?
In 10 years?
Well, okay, let's ask this slightly differently. Where do you want it to be, and where do you see it?
Well, in terms of the chimps, one of the things that we're also concerned about and researching is effective climate change. So far, what we've seen is affected humans more than the chimps, but at some point down the road, it's definitely going to affect them. And I did have a student that did her master's research using thermal imaging of the chimps, and she did. Wow, she looked at a lot of different types of data from captive chimpanzees, studied the chimps at my site, and used modeling software to come up with basically estimates of at what point would this area become, inhospitable for chimps. And I think one of her estimates was the year 2080, which is actually, further ahead than I thought it would be. And I really want to continue that sort of work. The thing about the Senegal chimps is they have to have access to water. They're actually not that food limited, but they have to have access to water. So that's something actually that we could manage if we had to. Right now, we manage it to some degree, but we don't, for example, install artificial water sources. We could, and I wouldn't be averse to that if at some point it came to that. But on another level, in terms of the Fongoli project, so I mentioned, I believe I mentioned that I have my assistant director of the project is Dr. Landing Baji. He's a Senegalese primatologist. He's currently doing a postdoc. And, at some point, I don't plan on going anywhere too soon, but at some point, I would like the project to basically be run entirely by Senegalese primatologists and associated with the university there in Senegal. And that's something we're working on. But the thing is that, as someone from the United States, I have access to more resources in terms of funding. And so we're just trying to work that out. But that's really where I want things to go as well, because it's it's obvious that, Dr. Baji is an expert at a number of things, but one of the things that he is amazingly good at is, talking with authorities and then local communities, and he's done a lot of work in that regard. So I think he's the perfect person to, stick with the project. I hope he always does, and work to resolve any problems that might come up. And I think we've done a good job of resolving minor conflicts. Over the years, you have conflicts between people and chimps or other animals. You become the go-to people. If there's other primates around, you go find those chimp people anyway. But on a larger scale, that's when I think we're going to have to be creative. And I will say, one of the things I've done in the past that I didn't think I'd ever do was to work closely with corporate level gold mining companies. And I worked as a consultant, and I still do work as a consultant, but I was also, for example, on a scientific panel. And that was very difficult because you see a lot of, obviously, habitat destruction, complete habitat destruction. So as in Fongoli, you have these artisanal gold mines. So people coming from all over West Africa as well as Senegal. The impact that they have is very different from a large corporate gold mine. And it's very hard to watch. But one thing that they also have the responsibility to do is to come up with offset programs. Not all of them do, but the one I worked with actually did a lot of outreach proactively, and they weren't required to do it, but they also listened. For example, when we talked about water sources and how important these were to chimps, in one case they moved a road, which I was pretty impressed by. So, because their plans basically gear towards making money, being very efficient. And so, they did actually take advice. That's something I never thought that I would be doing. And it is something, though, that has benefited the chimps in Senegal. And so that I find is just part of the complexity of conservation these days. And we have to be creative, kind of let go, in my case, of, my ideas about, corporate gold mines, for example.
It's definitely interesting when you have to work with, quote, the enemy to, it's sad, but we're at a point where I don't think there is a winning for chimps. There's more of compromises to continue to survive.
Yeah. Like you said, it's as primatologists or individuals, that are anthropologists, scientists say normally our resources are fairly limited and we're constantly looking for resources to keep the project going, et cetera. And yeah, there are other people that have more resources that we can work with. It's just kind of changing things up, working together, and yeah, making concessions, sadly. But
Yeah.
like I said, I mean, the Fongoli chimps, they've got us around to watch after them. And I'm just incredibly lucky that my head researcher, I think I also mentioned him, Michel Sajaho, he knows those chimps better than anybody in the world. And he told me that, so when I go out there, oftentimes, I'll tell them they get days off, but I'll say, you want to take some more days off or whatever, I'll go study the chimps. If he's not with the chimps for about 3 days, he starts dreaming about them at night because they're just part of his and so it's like you couldn't hope for somebody like that, and yeah, so I really lucked out. And yeah, so anyway, yeah.
No, that's great. When it comes to climate change, do you think the Fongoli chimps are more not prepared, just better positioned than forest chimps?
I mean, it's interesting. So, just in working with my PhD students this past year, we did a lot of reading about different aspects of climate change and how it would affect water quality. They're really looking at things like water quality, for example, because drying is a huge concern. So, for example, at the peak of the dry season, the Fongoli chimps have maybe 3 water sources within their 100-kilometer range. They're dependent on water sources. They cannot survive without those water sources. But so that's key. They have to have water. If the water dried up, they'd have to kind of switch, change their ranging behavior, find water. That probably wouldn't happen. Male chimps don't get along with one another. They might displace the neighboring community is smaller. It has fewer males as far as we know. And so, that might be something, but, you'd have definitely a dwindling of the population. The one thing they are familiar with, though, is open spaces. And so, like I was saying, people here practice horticulture. And so they'll have a few hectares that are cut. They'll farm that area for 6 years. They're out there during the rainy season, but during the dry season, they're back at their home village. And so the chimps use the landscape accordingly. And they're not dependent on these large, areas of forest. They are dependent on forest. So that's where the water is, these tiny patches of gallery forest. But whereas in a forest, to go to the extreme, if you think about orangutans, their forest is cut down. That's it. They can't. For one thing, if it's going to be cut down, it's going to be cut down for some, oil palm or something like that. There's no habitat left, and they just can't even move. Move to other forest patches is a huge challenge. It's a challenge for chimps as well, but these guys move very long distances. They have huge home ranges, and what we've seen in terms of habitat destruction is logging certain tree species, and it's been awful. But the thing is that you have at least some species regenerate very quickly in Senegal. They're shrubby species. Those are food species. And so you at least have some cover, you have food, but at some point you're going to hit a threshold, and then even the food's going to be affected. But so there are definitely levels of disturbance that these chimps, you talk about disturbance, anthropogenic, impact. I don't know if you want to call it disturbance, but, something human related, they're used to it to a certain degree. It's just that at some point there'll be a threshold and they won't be able to deal with it. And it depends on where the chimps live in the forest, what kind of conflict. So it always kind of comes down to that. What kind of conflict? Can they move to another site? How much logging is being done, that sort of thing.
Right. Now, are the Fongoli chimps any less arboreal than their relatives?
So they definitely have to travel in between tree crowns. Rarely are they in a situation where they're going to move between crowns. Sometimes, but that's usually between one crown to another, and that's it. It's not like you're moving, some distance. But really, and we did a study of bipedalism some time ago, was published in a master's thesis. And she did find that the Fongoli chimps were more bipedal, but not more terrestrial. But at that point, there was literally 3 long-term studies or 3 intensive studies of bipedalism in chimpanzees. So there are some differences, but we're revisiting that. And also, I know there are other studies that are ongoing as well. So we did see some differences, and statistically, they were more bipedal. But the other thing about that is that they were more bipedal in the trees. So that supports Stanford's, results from Wendy. But as far as their terrestrial travel, it was on par with, I believe, what you see at Tai. It exceeded what you see at some sites. But at Fongoli, they definitely have to come to the ground to travel almost any place. They still nest in trees, although they nest on the ground as well. But they're often on the ground. And one thing I really like is when you have researchers come from other sites, they're always amazed by the visibility. It's just so great at Fongoli because the canopy is low. So the average tree height is like 10 meters or less. And then it's very open during the dry season. During the wet season, it is horrible. For about a month, you cannot see a chimp because the grass is over their head. But during the dry season, which is incredibly long, the visibility is amazing. Yeah.
That's so cool and unique about the site. So since they are statistically more bipedal, does this show up anatomically at all? Are they biologically any different, in the way that their fingers curve possibly, or anything like that?
Yeah, that is a great question. We do have some skeletal material. We do have a skeletal collection. It's not great. I've had a couple of people look at it. As far as I know, I haven't seen results from that. I am talking with someone who focuses on bipedalism in chimpanzees, and we're hoping to have him come out next year and to look at that specifically. And so I wouldn't be surprised based on what has been seen at other sites. But yeah, it's not something that we've seen yet. And I don't know if it's good. I guess we don't have that many skeletal specimens, so we just have
with such a small population.
Yeah, and a lot of times the chimps will disappear and we just never find them again. So, but at any rate, that's definitely something I think he's going to look at next year. So
now, would that cause them to be a subspecies if they were different, or how would that work or affect? How would that affect them? Like, taxonomically.
I think it probably wouldn't affect them taxonomically, but at this point, but population level differences. I guess I might expect to see some sort of graded difference, but again, like if you move south from Senegal, but there's not that many long-term studies in West Africa compared to, like, Uganda has more studies than the whole of West Africa in terms of long-term chimpanzee studies, right? But yeah, I am interested, and it's another thing we're pursuing, is looking at their genome in more detail. I'm really interested to see, what we might see in this type of environment. And I've had other researchers at the site, Erin Westling, who did her Ph.D. work at Max Planck, did work on hormones and found some interesting things, among other things. She also did isotopes, a number of different studies. But so there's physiological aspects of the chimps' behavior and ecology, or biology, I guess I should say, that we want to pursue as well. But on that note, I will say that the subspecies thing has always been really intriguing to me, because I've come to appreciate subspecies differences much more since studying at Fongoli. So they're the varus, they're critically endangered. Again, there's not that many study sites in West Africa. So Tai, Basu, and there's some other sites now as well, but those were kind of the 2 oldest or longest running. And what's always amazing to me is when we see similarities between Fongoli and Thai, which is a rainforest, like a proper rainforest, not just a forest, but a rainforest. And so when you see similarities between Thai and Fongoli, to me, that's pretty surprising. I guess I would say surprising. I'm not surprised anymore, but it's like, wow, they're similar in this aspect or this respect. But in things like social grouping and aggression, they'll fall on a continuum that kind of edges towards bonobos in some respects compared to the East African chimpanzee, for example. And so to me, that's something that's been very interesting to me. And I feel like I'm biased because I study West African chimps, but sometimes it's a little bit overlooked, even though I think we're good about saying, look at all the diversity that we see in chimpanzees. The more populations we study, the more we realize that. But then sometimes we fall into that old habit of saying, chimpanzees do this, and at this site they might do this, or in this subspecies they might do this, but that's not the case for all chimps everywhere.
Right. So do we know when, well, actually, a better question, since we don't have too much time left, I don't think we can talk about Fongoli without talking about chimps and tool use.
Oh, sure.
So, a lot of people have heard about Fongoli chimps using tools, hunting with tools. What can you tell us about this that's not the hype, that's cutting through, the media? What are we looking at and talking about here?
Okay. So yeah, the tool assisted hunting is what we call it. Or spear hunting, if I want to be provocative, but that's the media's term, right? So it's a very interesting behavior. It is systematic. We see it every rainy season. So it peaks during June and July. That's actually the beginning of the rainy season in Senegal. I get messages from my team, and so-and-so got a bush baby, and that's why I have bush baby guilt, right? And so it's this very systematic way of hunting bush babies. So bush babies are the nocturnal primates. They're very small, and they are active at night. So during the day at Fongoli, they're almost exclusively nest cavity users. So at other places in Africa, these Senegal bush babies use little thickets and acacia trees, or little places where they nest. And at Fongoli, it's almost always in hollow trees and branches, and it's probably because of chimp predation. And so in order to get them while they're trying to sleep, the chimps make these stick tools. And so they break off a live branch 99 times 100. Somebody will break off a live branch. They'll trim the leaves off. They often trim the tip of it to make it point. We say to make it pointy, but just say trim the tip. And then they stab that into this hollow, and kind of it's a mixture of kind of rousing the bush baby and disabling the bush baby. And I will say there's been a few times, but very few, where they've actually killed the bush baby and been unable to get it out. And there's been times when they've injured the bush baby and they could not get the bush baby out. As you can imagine, it's hard for us to actually see what's going on, but we've done various studies using like plumbing equipment to look into cavities and figure out like why they didn't get the bush baby. So at any rate, so it's an interesting behavior, and again, I think it stems from the fact that there's not a lot of prey species, and somebody stumbled upon it and innovated that behavior, and it's just spread. But the other thing about that behavior is that females actually do it at a higher rate than males. So we have more males, and males do it, but we have more males in the population. And when you control for the number of males and females, actually males do it less than you would expect. Females and adolescent females do it significantly more than you would expect. And that also to me is not super surprising, given the fact that it gives those individuals access to meat. And one of the really surprising things about it also is that you don't have theft at Fongoli. So at a lot of sites, you hear about theft, like at Gombe and different sites. So a subordinate individual will capture something and the dominant or a dominant male will come over and take that. We've seen that, I guess, 5 times at Fongoli, and every time it was this huge deal. All the chimps were, chasing after the alpha. It was always the alpha, and it was only 2 alphas that had done this. Once to the point where he had to drop the monkey. It was a monkey in that case, but you don't see theft. And to me, that is incentive for females and adolescent females to hunt. And so it kind of, there's a number of things that tie into the behavior. One of the things I'm looking at right now that I find interesting, and we're finally getting a good enough sample size, is to see how individuals develop that behavior. So I'll just tell you that when they're young, they go through the steps perfectly. They'll break off a twig, literally a twig, when they're about 2 years old, go through all the steps. There's about 4 or 5 steps. And then they end up with this little twig that is not going to do anything, but they seem to be so, intense about using it. And it's not until they're older that they start to make tools of efficient lengths. And that actually varies for a while. And then they kind of seem to figure it out. So there seems to be, observation and mimicry of adults, I would say, and then a lot of cause and trial and error. I want to say learning going on, but at any rate, that's something I'm working on now, and we can see how the offspring of really successful hunters, how they develop the behavior and that sort of thing. But given the small population that we've got, it's taken some years to get that sample size in order.
Absolutely. And, that makes perfect sense considering the conditions that you're working under and with, and the, tracking chimpanzees in the wild cannot be an easy job, I imagine, especially, when you're talking about things like dealing with the weather and dealing with so many things that people, it's a lot more than just actually watching the animal that you have to deal with.
It's a great word.
What would you say, 2-part question, and then I think we will call this interview to a close. Part 1, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of your work? And part 2, what is your most passionate part?
Let's see. The most challenging right now, I have to say, is fundraising. That's because I'm in that spot right now. And 2, because I've, again, the project is 22 years old now. I have a great relationship. The people are like my family there, really. It's like going home. We live in a village there. That's where my site is. So to me, it's a constant battle, I would say right now. I feel like I'm in a battle to get funds to continue the project without interruption, but there are some great resources. So it's just that's what I'm doing right now instead of being at Fongoli, but that's life, right? In terms of, I just think about times I've been with the chimps, and they're just amazing times and experiences, and it doesn't get old. Okay, sometimes when you're watching somebody termite fish for 3 hours, it's finally like, come on, are you done? It's like, I always tell new people, it's like, okay, you're gonna, because they termite fish in terms of duration more than chimps anywhere else. It's a huge amount of their time during the dry season, and they termite fish all year round. But 3 hours in, you're like, really? You're just kind of sitting there, and I always tell students that they're going to be tired of termite fishing, and no one believes me, I don't think. And then, hours later, it's like, okay, is he going to leave at some point? But I just had some great experiences. And I have to say, the ones that stand out the most to me, are ones where the chimps communicate to me, and we have a no reaction policy. So we don't react to chimps unless we feel threatened. And that usually doesn't happen unless you're by yourself, and I'm the only one that goes by myself, except for the men that work for me. So usually you don't have to worry about somebody displaying at you. But, we don't, of course, play with them. We keep a certain distance. We have our masks on when we're within 12 meters, that sort of thing. But there have been cases over the years, a handful, where chimps have tried to, or have communicated to me And so one of my favorites was Bilbo, this adult male, and I was following him, and he broke off from the group, and he was basically trap lining beehives because they eat a lot of honey during the dry season, and it is dangerous for us. And I feel like they know me as that old one that can't run so fast and get stung by bees sometimes. That's what I feel like they think of me, because that happened. But at this time, as I was following Bilbo, and he went, a dead tree, there's no honey there, there's an old hive, and it was gone. And then he he went up and he got up to where he looked in, you could see bees coming out, and they kind of like wind up when they go to get the honey and grab it and then run, and you have to run too. And I thought I had moved away a decent amount to give myself running room, right? But I didn't want to lose Bilbo because he was my subject. And then he just kept looking at me, and I was like, what's he looking at me like that for? Usually it's not so pointed, the look. And so finally I'm like, well, okay. And I just felt like he wanted me to move back, and I moved back. And when I did, I moved back to about another 10 meters, then he grabbed and ran, and we both ran. And I was like, he was judging me, but it was this, I feel like it was empathy. It was some consideration. And there's other times they've done that before. And it's just like, why? You don't owe me anything. I'm following you around all the time. I mean, okay, sometimes we save them from things, but at any rate, I have memories like that were, not official interactions, but that was very dear to me, and I didn't get stung, so and he's a better judge of bees than me. But anyway, so it's usually things about the chimps and the people there too. I mean, they're like my family, and so that's the best part of my job, I think.
That is absolutely wonderful to hear. And I think, we couldn't end on a better note than that story with Bilbo the chimp. Although I do have to ask quickly, what is with Lord of the Rings names and chimpanzees?
I don't know. I have different people name the chimps, and I'm not sure who gave Bilbo that name, but that was a long time ago too. But we have very Senegalese names. So we have Mamadou but then now we have Arya is one of our more recent chimps, and we're very eclectic mix there.
That is awesome. Well, I want to thank you so absolutely much for coming on the show. It has been a blast. I have learned so much. I'm sure the audience has learned so much. And it was just a blast having you on.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. My pleasure. I could talk chimps any day. So I appreciate you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. And if you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe and turn on the notification button to be reminded every time a new video comes out, like this one, which will be premiering about 2 weeks from the recording of this date, because I'm trying to actually keep things on schedule now, guys. I promise. I know. We'll see. But again, a big thank you, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.